Ladies and gentlemen, Josh Richards. Welcome to the show, Josh. Welcome to Become Your Own Superhero.
Thank you for having me.
Well, you are very welcome. Very welcome. And you are beaming in from what part of the world right now?
We're tucked away down in Ocean Grove here, so I'm in Victoria, but we're sort of on the edge of the quarantine zone, so things aren't quite so bad here, but they're still pretty locked down.
And that's Victoria, Australia, for all you non-Australians that beaming in from wherever you are in the world. Not Lake Victoria. Is that in South Africa?
Lake Victoria?
No, I'm thinking Victoria Falls is in Zimbabwe.
Yeah, there we go.
And Josh Richards, amongst other things, you are a physicist, an engineer, a stand-up comedian, someone who participates in polyamory, and you're also a Mars One astronaut candidate. What a combination.
I used to call it career ADD. Definitely not able to stick with anything for any particular, got distracted by all sorts of different things on a regular basis. So jumped around and did a lot of different things. Originally started studying applied physics, doing a degree in applied physics, wanted to be an astronomer. Moved across to the Army as a combat engineer, so military engineering, explosives engineering, that side of things. And then, left that to get into the Royal Marine Commandos for a little while, and then decided to leave that for stand-up comedy. So it's been a bit of a weird and wonderful path so far.
It's like Jason Bourne going to host the Tonight Show or something.
Yeah, I think Matt Damon's far more attractive than I am, and he's less beardy as well. So, something like that.
It's a tough comparison. I'm not going to lie to you, and you're also nearly a twice published author.
Yeah, so
it's a very big achievement.
Yeah, I feel like that's actually what I've been trying to find all along, to be honest with you. Stand-up was an amazing avenue for creativity and being able to share different things, but I actually enjoyed writing the comedy shows more than I enjoyed performing them. Most stand-ups are natural extroverts, and it's actually taken me quite a long time to come to terms with the fact that I am not an extrovert. I'm quite the introvert. I actually don't like people that much at all. And writing books is a really great avenue for me to be able to sort of be creative and share those things that I want to share, but do it in an avenue that suits my temperament.
How would you describe an introvert to someone who is an extrovert?
Well, from a psychology background, sort of psychology perspective, it's essentially where you get energy from. So what happens to your personal energy levels through human interaction. So an extrovert interacts with people and finds that their levels lift. They embrace it, they enjoy it, they feel energized from talking to people. People like me tend to find conversing or speaking to large crowds exhausting. And so while I might enjoy it and might be very good at speaking to a very large crowd, I don't come off stage feeling excited or energized. I feel like it's relief rather than excitement that it's done. So it's very much focused on how you feel and what your energy levels do from human interaction. And my energy rises the less time I spend with people.
That's easily the best explanation of an introvert I've ever had in my life. So thank you, Josh. Because it's so foreign for a massive extrovert like I am, who I even feel like I've dialed it back over the last few years, particularly when I stopped drinking and doing drugs and philandering. But I am the opposite of that. I feel so uplifted coming off the stage, and it's so interesting that you'd end up with the career choices that you've made for someone who wants to shy away from that.
Well, it's been a sort of almost a natural progression. So the stuff that I did with the military in particular, the areas that I excelled in tended to be more solo ventures. They tended to be things where you were operating in very small groups. I didn't like being part of a large troop. I liked operating in some of the small reconnaissance units that we did where we had 3 or 4 guys. Sometimes you'd be down to 2. Those sort of things were great. If I got to do something by myself, even better. The best part about being out in the bush was that you wouldn't talk to anyone for a week. You'd use hand signals to signal what you were doing. There was nothing to talk about. You were out there to do a job. So you wouldn't need to sort of go up and have a conversation or anything like that. You would just do what you were doing. Moving into stand-up, that was more a case of wanting to share stuff, wanting to talk about things, wanting to make people laugh. And the best and most natural avenue I could find at the time was standing on stage and just talking. And I got quite good at it, got a lot of practice at doing that, but it was exhausting. And I really never fit in with other comedians. Folks who absolutely adore comedy, it never quite sat right. We'll talk about the polyamory side of things later on, but I dated a comedian in 2015 who was essentially the one who introduced me to it. And she was the exact opposite. She would come off stage glowing, like she would absolutely love it. And we never really reconciled the fact that I didn't feel that way. I didn't love it. It felt like an avenue for sharing information rather than something that I felt completely and utterly fulfilled by.
Wow. It wasn't Corinne Grant by any chance, was it?
No, it was not. I had a lot of time for Corinne. She's good value. She's great, but no, it was not Corinne Grant.
Well, the reason I asked, speaking of polyamory, I went on 2 dates with Corinne Grant years ago.
Yeah, cool.
I met her at the Corner Hotel in Melbourne.
Yep.
And I've been on a lot of dates in my life, and now I'm happily settled down with my beautiful fiance. But all she spoke about was like V8s. She's a huge V8 supercar fan.
Yeah.
And I was just like, get me the hell out of here. It was like, it was fucking hilarious. And because it was quite Corinne Grant, she was on Rove back then. She was pretty famous. Yep. And there was no chemistry, and God love her. There was no bad blood at all. I think it just fizzled out. This is before Tinder and Bumble sort of made their way into mainstream, but yeah, that was exciting. And
so Australian comedians in particular, but you see it in the UK a little bit as well. They tend to be fanatics about different things. And wrestling, for some reason, is one of the really big ones. So there'll be a lot of male stand-up comedians in particular, who are just crazy about WWE and all that sort of stuff. The ex-girlfriend of mine is a massive fan of Survivor, like would watch it and stream it live from the US. That extrovert personality combined with standing on stage in front of large groups of people that, for whatever reason, quite a lot of the very successful comics and a lot of the comics that I've worked with through the years, they all seem to have these shared passions. And I think it's the drama to a certain degree. There's a certain level of nihilism to it. There's what's going on, what they're watching and what they're super invested in doesn't actually mean very much for the future of humanity or anything like that. And yet the drama is so high. And for whatever reason, a lot of comedians seem to adore that sort of stuff.
Well, I had a crack at the Raw Comedy for 2 years in a row, 2015, 16. And my interest in it, Josh, was just to see whether I could do it. And I did it, and I made people laugh, and I was like, it was good fun. Yeah. But that thing that you touched on about, my purpose on this planet, I now figured out that I am to be on stage, but it's not doing comedy. It's doing things that will empower and inspire and motivate people as a motivational speaker. So what else did you get out of doing stand-up?
I think probably the biggest thing was the realization that it didn't suit me. It was that realization of the introversion. It was, like I said, an avenue that I could share information through. What changed, I suppose, was the comedy that I was doing, especially the last Edinburgh Fringe that I did was 2012. And the year before, I'd done a comedy show about the end of the world. It was all the science and religion around doomsday. And I was trying to make doomsday as funny as possible. And it was a fairly sciencey show. It tended to talk about like asteroids and what wiped out the dinosaurs and all these sort of different things. I took a bit of a sidestep in 2012. I decided to do a character sort of driven comedy show where I dressed up as a giant koala called Keith the Anger Management Koala. Yeah. Played ukulele and screamed at people. It was terrifying.
It's fucking funny too.
What a lot of folks don't realise about Keith is that he was essentially a mask for me to share stories from the military. Some of the stuff that had happened that I'd never spoken about was shared through Keith. It wasn't stuff that had happened to me. It was a funny story that Keith was talking about. And it might sound horrifying. And by me sharing it through that mask, it then allowed me to start sharing it later on. So I kind of took a sidestep and talked about dealt with some of those personal demons in 2012. But before the Fringe had even finished in 2012, I was already researching my next sciencey type show. And it was going to be a mission. It was going to be about a one-way mission to Mars. It was going to be all focused around how I'd learned during my physics degree, we had the technology to get to Mars, but we didn't have the technology to come back. And so I was going to write this comedy show saying, let's do it. Like, what's the point in staying on Earth? Let's just go for it. And as it was, I found an organization that was planning to do exactly that. So that provided sort of a pivot point for me to go, this isn't about comedy anymore. This is about how I'm planning to go to Mars. I've found this organization that will hopefully facilitate that. And I'm shifting from being a comedian into someone who uses it as science communication. I wasn't super focused on corporate speaking or anything like that. I really wanted to get people engaged with the idea of how important it was for us as a species to try and explore other planets. So I really focused on the science communication, and that was kind of my pivot away from this is all just for fun into I'm now using my previous comedy skills to communicate science. And by doing plenty of that, I've then sort of started to realize, actually, I don't like the performing side of things either. And that's why I've stepped into writing. So it's been a lot of trial and error to get to where we are now.
Well, if you write a list of all the things that you've done, been through and achieved in your life so far, Josh, the list seems like it's pretty long, and it might be the list of a couple of people at least. And it's so interesting that you would have this passion to go to Mars, and then Mars One would be announced, and from that 200,000 applicants, fast forward a few years, we're now down to the last 100 globally.
Yep.
And out of the 100 on the planet, you are the second Mars One astronaut candidate we've had on the podcast out of about 50 podcasts, which is pretty good odds. The young and lovely Diane McGrath, who you're good friends with. Good friends with.
I spoke to Diane this morning. She had a National Science Week event on this morning, and we had a bit of a chat afterwards. So she's doing really well. She's an amazing human being.
She is, and I don't know whether you're happy for me to. Maybe I'll leave that out for the meantime. It was more around the lines of your selflessness when we were talking about Diane. How we were both very adamant that Diane's going to get a shot and be part of maybe the first crew, the first 4 to go. How long it'll be, another 8-9 years, whatever. And how you would very kindly give up your seat if it meant that Diane could go if she wasn't picked.
Yeah. One of the biggest things, again, this has been a learning experience for me from the comedy side of things. Comedy is very much a look at me process. And I don't mean that in a nasty way, but it's very individual focused.
Yeah.
It's very much person with a microphone sharing their thoughts with an audience of adoring people. And that's kind of where the introversion side of thing comes in for me. I don't like attention like that. I don't like being the center of attention. If I can play a role and facilitate something to make things better for a group, absolutely. Like I'll use those skills to do that, but I don't need or want the attention. And that is kind of fed into the whole Mars project as well, in that I am, ex-military white dude who fits the same profile as pretty much all of the Mercury and astronauts, with the exception that I haven't done military aviation. I know I can fly. I've been a pilot, but I haven't come from a military aviation background that most of those guys did.
Yeah.
They were all guys. They were all white American dudes, all military, all the same background, all the same education, very much cookie cutter. And I fit a lot of those profile points. There are mountains of role models for future astronauts, for kids growing up who want to be astronauts, who look like me already. You don't need another like white ginger idiot going and being a role model for kids. What you do need is people who don't look like me, people from diverse backgrounds, people like Diane, who, you know, is an amazing human being from all sorts of different elements that add extra diversity. The stuff that she's done for girls getting involved with science has been incredible. So if I can contribute to the program, that's great. But if there's a choice between, you know, me, who looks like every other astronaut from that you see in the past, versus someone like Diane, or Yara Golden, she's an American-Mexican background, amazing human being working. I think she's doing a master's at MIT at the moment. Like, there are so many other people who come from a far more diverse background than I do, that would do so much better and would do so much more for this planet and our species by being representatives that look different to what I do.
Yeah.
Like I said, the white dudes that work in space and space and science and technology, it'd be nice to have some really amazing role models that don't look like me instead.
Yeah. Well, it's only a matter of time, I think, before it happens. You know, there really hasn't been much in the way of space anything since they landed on the moon in '69, really, has there? There's been bugger all.
I mean, the saddest element in this is that there has been a lot. There's a lot that's happened. It's just that people focus on the lunar landings. We have a flying laboratory that's been permanently inhabited in space since 2000. The International Space Station, soaring around the planet at 27,000 kilometers an hour for the last 20 years. It's always had people on board. There have always been people living in space since the year 2000. You know, SpaceX is doing extraordinary things, but the big element with SpaceX isn't just that their technology is you know, leaping ahead. They also broadcast it very well. They also make it publicly available so people can see what they're doing. And NASA is an easy one to sort of single out because, you know, a lot of folks associate space with NASA, but they are just the US space agency. They are one of many. And a lot of the space agencies have had big issues with people sort of seeing things as being a bit boring. The space agencies have tried to make space exploration and space travel fairly routine because routine means safe, and exploration and safety are two things that are fairly opposed to each other.
Yeah.
There's a lot of, I won't even begin to try and remember who the quote's from, but it's one that I use on a reasonably regular basis, is that the road to exploration is often paved in blood. People are doing things they've never done before, and that means taking risks that you don't even necessarily know you're taking. So if things are routine, you're not really exploring. And it's one of the biggest barriers that NASA in particular has had to the idea of exploring Mars, because you actually need to send people to another planet and trust that they'll figure the things out for themselves, that they'll solve those problems, that they'll make the decisions that you hope they make. And if they don't, trusting that they'll make the ones that will act in the best interests. And NASA as an organization has tended to be very conservative, understandably so. There's taxpayers' money involved. So they really want people who are very highly trained to do things that are often not super complicated, but they do them unquestioningly. And releasing that control from Earth and trusting people to go to another planet is definitely one of the biggest barriers. The culture side of things is one of the biggest barriers to actually exploring another planet.
Yeah. Do you know word for word the whole script from Matt Damon in The Martian?
I know a lot, far more than I probably should.
I love that movie, man. They're my favorite kind of movies. How close to reality do you reckon that's going to be?
It depends on how you focus on it.
Like the growing of the spuds in the manure.
Growing spuds is something that is already occurring. So with NASA, the European Space Agency, different researchers around the world have been growing potatoes and other plants in what we call Mars simulations, regolith. So it's simulated Mars soil that's been made up here on Earth using the same sort of mix of what we know from the rovers on Mars. They have been checking out the dirt basically and telling us what's in the dirt. We then make that dirt up here in bulk as well and grow plants in that. And one of the biggest concerns we've had out of all of that is that there's quite a few heavy metals in the regolith on Mars. And so they've basically been trying to figure out, is this going to be an issue? And are the plants going to absorb this? So the tomatoes, for instance, going to absorb the cadmium that's in the soil. And most of the research that come out has said, no, it won't be an issue. The biggest problem we've got with dealing with soil on Mars is the perchlorates. There's a whole range of magnesium, potassium perchlorates, which they act as a superoxide, and they actually attack our thyroid glands. They shut down our thyroid. They actually tend to be quite poisonous. So they're fairly easy to filter out of the soil. You essentially wash it with water, clean the soil and wash these things out. But yeah, there's the dust on Mars is fairly toxic. So Matt Damon kind of skipped a step in there when he's bringing in truckloads of dirt into the hab and then soaking it with water because anytime he was breathing the dust around it, it would have been attacking his thyroid.
Well, he did look pretty average by the time they rescued him. So maybe his thyroid function was fucked.
So again, it depends on how deep you want to delve in here. The whole thing about him looking pretty shabby at the end, people talk about eating potatoes. It sounds awful, but the Irish pretty much proved that that's not a sustainable diet. That's not something you can keep doing for long. If you were to put butter on all of those potatoes, you'd get a full nutrient mix. But actually eating potatoes on their own is not sufficient to keep people alive long term. So he, from a nutritionist perspective, he would have died. Yeah.
Yeah, that's the issue with plants, right? There's no if you have to exist. I don't know whether you can exist on a pure. Will it be purely vegan diet once you've been there for a while?
We'd be expecting to be completely vegan while we're there, which I know is not something that Diane in particular, a fairly ardent carnivore, is a big fan of. It's actually something that I am not a huge fan of either. But the reality of the mission is that we need to be fully sustainable. And in terms of sustainability, the idea of having large animals is certainly not an option. Entry level, we're probably looking at insects. So in terms of growing crickets and things like that, that's probably the best option. Again, I'm delving into Diane's content here. But yeah, in terms of sustainability, growing crickets, breeding crickets is definitely probably option number one for us.
Yeah.
And the next thing we go to after something like this is probably chickens. Chickens are fairly easy to look after. Honeybees will sort of play a role in pollination for plants as well. And we might look at something like aquaponics or some other sort of system where we can have fish.
Yeah, it's a really interesting one because I like Diana, a carnivore as well for a multitude of reasons. And for that reason alone, for me, I was just thinking about this before we jumped on this interview. I couldn't do it. I couldn't do it.
Yep.
And that's fine. But it's interesting. I watched something recently. It was a podcast, and the guy's name escapes me. He's the guy that's the AI expert. He's been doing it for 30 years. He's been on most of the major podcasts. He's been on Joe Rogan. He's talking about this singularity event that's going to happen.
Not Ray Kurzweil?
It might be, yeah. Yeah, he's kind of like a bit of a hippie dude.
Yeah.
Really interesting guy. Do you dabble or have had much effort from your own personal interest in singularity and how that will impact this whole thing, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm certainly no expert in any of this sort of stuff, but that side of things and the future of technology is definitely something that I am very heavily invested in. My primary interest, I suppose, is the philosophy and the ethics behind a lot of this sort of stuff. If you are reaching, Ray Kurzweil talks about singularity, and that is something that we're definitely streaming towards very quickly. My area of interest, I suppose, is asking the questions, if we're writing code and that code is starting to write itself, what are the biases that we're introducing as human beings? Again, talking about white dudes doing stuff, vast majority of coders, programmers through Silicon Valley in particular, are straight white dudes. So what biases are they introducing? What sort of things are they not aware of that may impact other users that don't come from their same cultural background? And the potential for those sort of elements, those kind of biases to creep into a super intelligent AI are pretty scary. That's something that I sort of, I'm concerned about and interested in.
Yeah.
About how we're not necessarily going to produce something that's evil. We just could potentially produce something that does its job far better than we really want it to.
Yeah.
An element there where we actually want imperfection in some of these machines because they can take things far further than we ever needed to or ever wanted them to. It's like reductum ad absurdum, like taking things to absurdities far further than we want them to.
And just for those that are listening, wondering what the hell singularity is, it's the progression of artificial intelligence, which will reach a point that it then becomes smarter than the human brain, if I'm not mistaken. And then they think that it'll get to a speed at some point where they'll generate 4 Nobel Prize winning items a minute versus 4 a year, right? Like millions of times faster problem solving. And it'll happen in our lifetime. For anyone that's like, you and I are a similar age, it'll happen, I think, in the next 30, 40 years, I think.
Right. Again, Ray Kurzweil's changed predictions a little bit, but it's definitely even, I would say, most of what I've read has been suggesting sort of 2030s, 2040s. So not even 30, 40 years away. And it's not necessarily about it being smarter than us. It's actually the point where progress becomes exponential. So it stops being, progressive improvements. It reaches a point where it can start improving itself far faster than we could ever improve it. It just races away. So essentially you see the line just pretty much go straight up. It stops being a case of, even progress or relatively linear progress, and it becomes truly exponential.
And the thing that I find so interesting about it, Josh, is that I was exactly like you. I was like, oh, whoa, like what's going on? Like what impact is that going to have, right? The thing I think about, if they say it's going to be as effective as they say it's going to be, then it'll solve all of the problems that I have in my mind right now, in theory, right?
Yeah.
And a million more. It'll solve the population crisis. Like it'll solve any problem that we have. And I think that's really cool. Like I'm looking at it from a more optimistic point of view. But in the end, it could be Terminator.
Yeah. Don't get me wrong. Like I'm definitely, as much as I'm a grump, I'm an eternal optimist with this sort of stuff. The concern is not about things improving. It's a concern about disparity. We have a look at the way things are right now, and compared to the conditions for living, compared to where we were 50, 100 years ago, it's a whole order of magnitude improved. However, there's still a lot of folks who are living in extreme poverty. So it's not just about things improving. It's about improving the floor for everyone. And that's what I suppose I'm talking about with those biases being introduced into AI. It's not just about solving problems. It's asking what problems are being solved by that AI and what biases it's carrying with it, so that it's not just solving problems that might deal for you and I, again, as cis white dudes. It's also going and solving problems that aren't going to harm other people and are going to help improve things for folks from all sorts of different backgrounds. So I suppose, yeah, the ethics and the philosophy blends with cultural backgrounds to start asking questions about what problems are going to be solved. Is it an AI that is going to solve our problems by going Terminator and murdering everyone else? If that's the best solution for the well-being of the creator, is that an ethical solution? So I suppose I agree. It's always getting better. You look at the World Health Organization, you look at the UN's data and all this sort of stuff. Things are getting better for everybody, everywhere. But there's still some pretty drastically awful things that are going on, and the wealth, the misdistribution of wealth is probably one of the biggest concerns that I've got. And the idea that AI would enable whoever produces it to have enormous wealth, far, far more than anyone else, is a bigger concern. So
yeah,
I'm more about the equality side of things, of how we get enough for everybody, rather than just empowering the folks who've got control over what is essentially a weapon of mass destruction with something like AI.
Yeah.
You can harness the atom to produce huge amounts of power for energy. You can also harness it into a bomb. And who controls those technologies is a concern, and how it's being used is a concern.
Why don't we, just a thought that came into my brain as you were saying about the atom, why don't we blow up all the garbage that we're creating? What's wrong with that?
I mean, what's the end goal with it is the question I've got. So we could blow things up, but the energy that's required in order to do that, it doesn't go away. This stuff doesn't go away unless you're, like I said, literally splitting atoms, and in which case you're converting mass into energy. You're not really losing anything. You're distributing it. So rather than blowing up garbage, it'd be much nicer to collect all the garbage up and find different ways of sorting it. Take banana peels, take pig manure, take all that sort of stuff, and look at the things that it produces and find ways to repurpose that.
Yeah.
And it kind of comes back to that spaceship Earth attitude that Buckminster Fuller talked about, where you're in a closed circuit environment. You're like, Earth is, for the most part, a closed circuit environment. It's a closed life support system. We get a little bit of rock and a few other bits and pieces coming in from outer space, but for the most part, it's closed.
Yeah.
So you need to find ways to utilize the resources that are available and treat them as resources, rather than just treating things like a waste product and then dumping them out somewhere else.
Just for the record, listeners or viewers, I'm not a fan of blowing up garbage. I'd rather use that AI to figure out ways of not producing the garbage in the first place. I don't want seagulls with 6-pack plastic around their neck. But let's deviate to another section of the chat that's incredibly interesting to me, and I know will be incredibly interesting to our listeners. The subject of polygamy or polyamory or polymery. How do you pronounce it, and which one is it?
So, so from a definition perspective, polygamy is talking about one guy marrying multiple women. From the Latin polyamory, you're actually talking about many loves, multiple loves. So I met, like I said earlier on, I met someone in 2015 who had a boyfriend already. And I was completely and utterly smitten. And she basically talked about how she and her boyfriend were sort of trying to figure out a way to be open. And she was navigating it. It was all new territory for her. It was very new territory for me. I had no idea what I was doing. And the idea that I might be involved with someone who was emotionally involved and romantically involved with someone else was challenging to wrap my head around. I suppose the way that I reconciled it at the time was that I'm not planning on staying on this planet. Like, I'm not interested in the traditional pathway of having kids, getting married, all that jazz. Like, that's never really appealed.
Yeah.
And so to be introduced to someone who I thought was extraordinary, I still think it's pretty extraordinary, to be introduced to someone like that and have them introduce this idea that love and relationships don't have to be monogamous, it threw me for six, because I had realistically grown up around a fairly strict structure where if you met someone and you liked them, but you're already involved with someone else, then, you kind of had to cut off that part of the way that you felt. You couldn't necessarily express the reality or be honest with your own feelings. You had to deny that part of you, because the cultural expectation around it was that, you've got a girlfriend, so you can't feel that way about someone else. And the idea that barrier wasn't there, that barrier was artificial, was quite a realization for me. And so, I suppose polyamory is one way of describing it. I think more realistically, from a more accurate perspective and a more academic perspective, I think what I do is actually more in line with emotional anarchy, in that I treat everyone on a one-to-one basis, and the way that I interact with everyone, regardless of whether or not it's romantic, sexual, like platonic, whatever, male, female, whatever, it's on a one-to-one basis. So it's not based around the idea that I've got this relationship, so I can't have this relationship with this person. They're all treated individually, and they obviously interact. So-and-so doesn't like your best mate doesn't like that you're dating this new girl or whatever. Like, those sort of things still happen. I suppose where I'm coming from is I don't actually care what other people think about my other relationships. I care about the individual relationships. I'm forming a connection, a friendship with you. And if I met someone else that didn't like you, for instance, that wouldn't then impact the way that I connected with you. It's got nothing to do, their opinion has got nothing to do with our connection. And I suppose I apply that same attitude to romantic relationships, which is why everyone gets excited and interested about it as well. In that, if I meet someone who I am attracted to and I'm interested in, then I'm going to pursue that regardless of any other relationships or other connections that I might have as well.
It's an amazing concept to wrap your head around for anyone that hasn't ever heard of it or know much about it at all, because it's so intriguing. And like, a lot of the things that I think people attribute to what you're talking about are, Ricky Lake or Phil Donahue or Jerry Springer, heaven forbid. But it's not like that at all. And one of my favorite sections of xnxx.com, which is a very famous porn site, not that I indulge myself in a lot of pornography these days, is the swinger. There's the swinger section. And there's some really well-made videos that they're made by Playboy or one of the major brands. And they have real couples that go in there and swing for the first time or second time. And they have the whole build up as well as the sex part. I like it for the stories.
So yeah, I suppose the swinging side of things is definitely a different element to what I suppose I'm talking about.
Yeah.
That it factors in. And I suppose the big thing to take away from all of this isn't this is the right way, this is the wrong way. there is a huge spectrum of what people are comfortable with and what people want to do and what their interests are. And I suppose provided, as far as I'm concerned, it is provided everyone is honest with everyone else, everyone has got sort of active, informed consent on what's occurring, then do whatever. That's been very much my attitude for quite a few years now, that it doesn't really matter what other people think of it. It's what you're interested in. Swinging has got zero interest for me. The idea of seeing a partner with someone else, not my thing. I don't really understand the appeal of that, but I know that some people do. And if that's their thing, go for it. There are different things there's things in bed that I like that I don't like. And you just say that. And no one gets offended by it. No one gets upset. You just sort of go, well, no, it's not my thing. Or no, I do really like this. And as long as people know, they then have a choice as to whether or not they want to engage in that. If I've met people in the last few years who we love each other, we're smitten with each other, but they're not comfortable with the idea of me seeing anyone else. And my attitude to it is, that's fair. I completely understand that this is part of who I am. I don't really value monogamy personally. And so you're going to kind of have to try and figure it out. I'm not going to jam it in your face either. I'm not going to be deliberately setting out to upset you, but this is a factor in who I am. And if it's a deal breaker for you, then it's a deal breaker. And again, no offense, no upset around any of it. It's purely coming from a perspective of being honest with who you are and what you're looking for and where your interests lie, and being open and honest with other people and sort of taking very much a take it or leave it attitude, not aggressively, but from a place of honesty, I suppose.
Josh, it's the best way that you can go about anything in life. You know, like it really is. Like I was talking to someone earlier today about a relationship that I had 3.5 years ago. I started dating a 30-year-old virgin when I was 35, and for religious and cultural reasons. And I fell very quickly in love with this woman. And about a month in, she said to me, look, I've got something to talk to you about. And she said that she was saving herself for marriage. And this was before I became a bit more self-developed, Josh. And she gave me the right of exit. She said, I understand if this isn't your thing. You know, I didn't realize until my feelings became really strong. And she said, you've got a week to think about it. And I was like, I waive the right. I love you. I'll do whatever. And then I spent the next 12 months trying to fuck her. And I ruined the relationship. And because of my inability to have the courage to make a ballsy decision and go, do you know what? Now I think about it, this is a really important part of my life. I'd given up drinking, smoking, and drugs at that point, and gambling, and like making sweet, sweet love was pretty high on my list of priorities. And I, to her credit, she stayed strong, and I never consummated that relationship. But I learned some really important lessons after a horrendous breakup about the importance of setting very clear boundaries for my own needs in order to get a much better outcome. And now I'm in the relationship of my dreams with someone that I'm totally honest with and is totally honest with me. So I applaud you, sir.
It's not without mistakes. Don't get me wrong. Like, it's really just about knowing where you stand and knowing that those things can change too. Maybe the situation changes. I've had enough practice, I suppose, now over the last 5 years to be pretty confident in where I stand for most things. But I've been surprised as well. I got back together, foolishly got back together with an ex-partner a couple of years back, and she was very anti the idea of me seeing anyone else. It was going to be exclusively monogamous, and I contemplated it. I thought about it, and trialed it for a short period of time and just went, this is not me. This is not me being honest with myself. without making it too gender specific, I like women. Like, I'm good friends with a lot of women, and it's not always sexual. It's often not sexual. Some of my best friends are women, and it's a completely platonic thing. I like women, but I'm also not going to lie when I'm physically attracted to someone. And so it's about continuously negotiating all of that, and being aware that you change, other people change, and all of these things can vary. So don't sort of lock it down too hard. Be honest about where you are right now and understand, and everyone has to be on the same page that these things can change over time.
Yeah, 100%. And one of the things I think probably wouldn't be quite so bad when you're living your lifestyle, it'd be yelling out the wrong lover's name in the heat of passion.
I have not done that. I will admit to once mumbling the wrong name in my sleep. But no, I haven't called out someone's. Yeah.
Let's talk about your health journey, because you've nearly died.
Yeah,
or
a few
pretty
times,
close to it.
I think I know what. Yeah, I think I know where you're going. Yeah.
And most people have had a near-death experience, or so they think. Like when they fell in the pool when they were 6 years of age. But yours was pretty serious, and something that ties in with a lot of the stuff that I'm interested in terms of a lot of nutritional and health, and it was Lyme. You got a Lyme tick bite?
Yeah. Yeah. So when I was in the UK, so after I left the army and the navy here, I moved across to the UK and joined the British Royal Marine Commandos and spent 12 months with them. And while I was out on Dartmoor National Park during an exercise, we're out in minus 22, minus 19 or whatever it was during the blizzard.
I don't think it matters once it gets that cold.
I was about to say, once you're past about minus anything, it doesn't really matter too much. But I got bitten by a deer tick while I was out there, and didn't think anything of it. I'd been bitten by hundreds of ticks when I was with the army in Australia. Didn't give it a second thought. Pulled this tick off and binned it, and then went about my day. At the time, I was probably one of the fittest guys in the troop. I'd actually just won an award for fitness from our PTs, our physical trainers.
Wow.
As a PT superior, and within a couple of weeks, I was getting confused. I was not able to sort of keep down food. Things weren't great. I was starting to get weaker. And no one really had an explanation. Everyone just sort of thought, oh, something wrong with Richard's. And about 6 weeks after this tick had bit me, I had two of my mates carry me into hospital because I couldn't walk. And they couldn't figure out what it was. I had mountains of blood tests. I think I had something like 16 shots of blood taken out.
Wow.
In the space of a few days. Bit of a rainstorm here, I apologise.
Oh, wow. I thought it was a herd of elephants coming through your laundry.
It's a bit of a thunderstorm happening here.
Cool.
Huge number of blood samples taken out. No one could figure anything out. They started testing me for HIV, for celiac disease, for hepatitis B, because of the places I've been in the past.
Yeah.
There was a huge number of lists of potential diseases that might have been lurking in my system for years that they had to test for. The one that they tested earliest was Lyme's. The problem was they took the blood sample first thing in the morning. They didn't send the blood samples to the lab until later that afternoon. And in the particular test they were looking at, you actually need to test that blood sample within 6 hours of it coming out of the body to get a positive or a negative result. So it took another doctor looking at my results a couple of weeks later while I was still wasting away in hospital to suddenly realise that they had a null result for Lyme's. They didn't have a positive or a negative one. So they ran the test again, and sure enough, I came back Lyme's positive. But by that stage, like I was starting to learn to walk again. It was still in my system. Like they still hadn't started to treat the Lyme's, but I was learning to walk again, and they hadn't thought I'd get out of hospital. I was pretty light. I was one of the lightest guys in the troop. The commandos have a minimum weight of 60 kilos, and I was hovering at about 61, 62. when they put me in a hospital, I lost 8 kilos in 6 days. And yeah, I was just a wreck. So it was a bit of an experience.
Got a deer tick disease tick?
Yeah. No, I didn't know anything about Lyme's disease before it. And I sure as hell learnt a fair bit about it through the process. So,
is it considered an autoimmune disease? Like it triggers an autoimmune response?
It's a bacterial blood poisoning. So it's a bacteria that comes off the tick's teeth, the jaws, and it acts as it's blood poisoning essentially.
God damn, that sounds horrendous.
It was not fun.
So what's next? When are you going to find out about at least being included in the initial 24 astronaut shortlist? That will be.
So that's a complicated question. So the next stage for us is to cut the group down from the 100 to about 24. There's elements that we are privy to as candidates that we can't share publicly. There's still ongoing discussions around all of this sort of stuff. But the big question, I suppose, for us is when's it going to move forward? The plan had been for some time to get all 100 of us together in one place and do group testing like that. But with COVID-19 going on at the moment, pretty much everything's on hold. Yeah. So the real question for us is, do we stick with it, keep bunkering down and then see what happens on the other side? We've had some folks who've dropped out. I've had quite a few people drop out through the years as they've started to question whether or not this is something they actually care about. It's the whole project forces you to question where your priorities are and what's important to you. And those things, again, change over time. What people might be comfortable with when they first signed up, maybe give it a few years and they start to sort of go, oh, maybe this isn't the thing for me. Maybe I do want to have kids, or, maybe I want to settle down, or maybe I found what I was really looking for, and Mars was just the idea of going to Mars was just a stepping stone on that. And that's up to everyone to figure out for themselves. For me, every step of the way, it's gotten narrower. I've found like I've discovered more about who I am in the last 8 years since I've been involved with Mars One than I have at any other point in my life. The Commandos tested me in a way that I learnt what I was physically capable of, far more than anything else. But from an emotional perspective, from a mental perspective of what is important to me, Mars One has been by far the big challenge. It's been the question, thousands of other questions that I've then had to go through and figure what works for me and what doesn't.
It's something so like I said before, like those movies, like the space movies, I love them and Back to the Future, and it's a real thrill to have you on the show. And for those that want to find Josh Richards and learn more about what you're doing, how can they do that?
Easiest thing is for people to basically check out cosmicnomad.space. So rather than having a .com on the end of my website, it's literally the word space, as in outer space. So if they type in cosmicnomad.space, that'll take them to the landing page for the book that I've got coming out in September 17th, Cosmic Nomad. But it's also part of my larger website, which has got all the details around the speaking engagements that I do, the writing that I do for Patreon, all these different things. So the raw website itself is joshrichards.space, but people seem to find Cosmic Nomad is easier to remember.
Well, look, the other stuff that we could have touched on today, Josh, like it could be a 5-hour show. We haven't even discussed your military background, and maybe we revisit this at a later date when the shortlist has come down and the clock is ticking. But before we wrap this up, Josh, was there anything that you wanted to finish on?
No, other than I suppose that the whole experience with being involved with Mars One has been all about self-reflection. It's all about me figuring out what works for me, and that doesn't always marry up with what I was raised with or what other people might expect from me. But when you ask a question that's, again, I hesitate using the pun, but when you ask an out of this world type question of would you leave the Earth behind forever, you tend to get unusual answers. And the thing that I love, I suppose, about Mars One the most is that I get to ask that question of other people on a regular basis, and I get to see them figuring out for themselves how they want to live their lives. Because going to Mars is just one thing, but the real question is sort of how we want to live life while we're here on Earth right now, before we go to Mars. And I suppose that's what I've tried to tackle in the new book. And it's the one thing that I absolutely adore about the program is that it challenges people and makes them ask questions about whether or not they would do it or not.
Well, we wish you all the best and a big live long and prosper. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Josh Richards.